was never supposed to be more than a temporary job. I had just moved into a tiny apartment after quitting my previous job, and rent was due in less than 2 weeks. When I saw an online listing for a night security position at a storage facility on the outskirts of town, I applied without thinking twice. The pay was better than anything else I could find. The manager interviewed me the same afternoon. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept in days. After asking only a few questions, he offered me the job immediately. That should have been my first warning. Before I left, he handed me a ring of old keys and a flashlight. "Most nights are quiet," he said. Then he hesitated. "If you hear knocking coming from one of the storage units, don't investigate." He laughed awkwardly after saying it. I laughed too. I assumed it was some weird joke meant to scare the new guy. Around 10:45 p.m., I parked outside the facility. The place was enormous. Rows and rows of identical metal storage units stretched into the darkness. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, and beyond it there was nothing but trees. No nearby houses, no traffic, just silence. Inside the office, I found a monitor connected to nearly 30 security cameras. Most showed empty lanes between storage units. My job sounded easy. Every hour, I had to walk around the property with a flashlight and make sure every gate was locked. That was it. The first patrol was uneventful. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. The only sounds were insects and the occasional rustle of leaves. By midnight, I was convinced the manager had been trying to entertain himself with that strange warning. At exactly 12:17 a.m., something hit one of the storage doors. Bang. Bang. I froze. A second later, bang. It sounded like someone was trapped inside. I walked back toward the office and looked at the camera monitor. You need to say, "but bless." The door wasn't moving. No one was outside. Another bang echoed across the property, louder this time. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. Every instinct told me to ignore it, but curiosity won. As I got closer to C-14, the knocking stopped. The silence felt worse. I pointed my flashlight at the door. Nothing. I stood there for almost a minute before laughing at myself. Probably an animal. Or maybe something had shifted inside the unit. I turned around to leave. That's when I heard a voice behind the metal door. It whispered, "Help me." Every hair on my arms stood up. It wasn't loud. It wasn't desperate. It sounded calm, almost patient. I backed away without saying a word. When I reached the office, I checked the rental records for unit C-14. The screen was blank. According to the system, that storage unit didn't exist. I stared at the computer screen for several seconds, waiting for the rental records to load. Nothing changed. Unit C-14 simply wasn't there. Every unit before it existed. Every unit after it existed. C-13. C-13. Then C-15. As if C-14 had been erased from the system entirely. I leaned back in my chair, trying to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it had been merged with another unit years ago. Maybe the software was outdated. But none of that explained the voice. I looked back at the live security cameras. The corridor where C-14 stood was completely empty. No movement. No people. Just rows of silent metal doors stretching into darkness. Then one of the monitors flickered. A burst of static covered the screen for less than a second. When the picture returned, someone was standing in the middle of the lane. My heart stopped. The figure wasn't facing the camera. It stood perfectly still, hands hanging at its sides. I immediately grabbed the mouse and switched to another camera overlooking the same area. Nothing. The lane was empty. I switched back. The figure was gone. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I replayed the footage from 30 seconds earlier. The corridor remained empty until 12:18:43. Without walking into frame, without appearing from either side, the figure was simply there, as if it had always been standing there, and the camera had only just noticed it. I paused the video. Even zoomed in, I couldn't make out a face. The image became grainy the closer I looked, almost like the camera refused to focus on it. Suddenly, the office phone rang. The sharp sound echoed through the tiny room. I nearly jumped out of my chair. Nobody was supposed to call after midnight. I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Only static answered. Then, after several seconds, a slow, raspy whisper. "Don't let it hear you." The line went dead. I checked the caller ID. No number. Just a blank screen. A second later, every monitor in the office went black. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the emergency lights. Then the cameras slowly came back online, one by one. Every corridor looked normal, except camera 12. The screen showed C-14. The storage door was open. I was certain it had been locked only minutes earlier. Inside was nothing but darkness. The camera couldn't see beyond the entrance. It was as though the light itself stopped at the doorway. Something moved, not outside the unit. Inside it, a faint silhouette shifted just beyond the darkness. Then the feed froze. I waited for the image to refresh. Nothing. The silhouette remained trapped on the screen, blurred and motionless. I clicked through the other cameras. Every one of them worked perfectly. Camera 12 was the only one that had frozen. I leaned closer to the monitor. The figure was still standing, just inside the darkness of C-14. I couldn't make out a face. I couldn't even tell if it was looking toward the camera. The image suddenly distorted. Horizontal lines rolled across the screen before it flashed completely white. When the picture returned, the figure was gone. The storage unit was empty again. I replayed the recording. The footage skipped forward by itself. Nearly 2 full minutes had disappeared. I frowned. That wasn't possible. The DVR timestamp jumped from 12:21:08 to 12:23:17 without showing anything in between. I replayed it again. The exact same thing happened. My eyes shifted toward the live clock on the wall. It read 12:23 a.m. Whatever happened during those missing 2 minutes, the cameras had never recorded it. I sat there in complete silence. Every instinct told me to stay inside the office and call the police. But what exactly was I supposed to tell them? That a security camera had glitched? That I heard a whisper over the phone? No one would believe me. I looked back at camera 12 one last time. The storage door was still open. If someone had broken into the unit, it was my responsibility to check it. I grabbed my flashlight from the desk. The batteries were almost new. I tested the beam against the office wall. Bright. I slipped the heavy ring of storage keys into my pocket and stepped outside. The cold night air felt even heavier than before. Not a single breeze moved through the rows of storage units. Everything was unnaturally still. As I walked towards C-14, my footsteps echoed across the empty pavement. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder. No one. Nothing. Just endless rows of identical metal doors. The closer I got, the quieter everything became. Even the insects had stopped making noise. Finally, I reached C-14. The door was hanging open, exactly as it had appeared on the monitor. Only a narrow gap separated it from the frame. I swallowed hard and pushed it open. The rusted rollers groaned loudly. My flashlight swept across the inside. The unit was completely empty. Bare concrete walls, dust-covered floor. No shelves, no boxes, nothing. I let out a slow breath. Maybe someone had been hiding here earlier and slipped away before I arrived. Then my flashlight reached the back wall. Something caught the light. A rusted metal ring was embedded in the concrete floor. I stepped closer. It wasn't part of the floor. It was attached to a heavy steel hatch, hidden beneath years of dust. I crouched beside it, brushing away the dirt with my hand. The edges of the hatch became visible. Someone had gone to great lengths to conceal it. I wrapped my fingers around the metal ring and pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a loud metallic groan, the hatch slowly lifted. A wave of freezing air rushed upward. Beneath it was a narrow concrete staircase, disappearing into complete darkness. I aimed my flashlight down the steps. The beam barely reached the bottom. The silence was overwhelming. Taking one slow breath, I stepped onto the first stair. The first step groaned beneath my weight, then the second. By the third step, the sounds of the storage facility above had completely disappeared. It felt as though I'd stepped into another world. The concrete walls were damp, streaked with decades of moisture. Rusted handrails ran along both sides of the staircase, and the air grew colder with every step. My flashlight beam barely reached the bottom. When I finally stepped off the last stair, I found myself standing in a long underground corridor. Old fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Some worked, most didn't. The hallway stretched so far into the darkness that I couldn't see where it ended. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. Drip, 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 drip. That was the only sound. I looked behind me. The staircase was still there. For a moment, I considered turning back. Instead, I kept walking. Every footstep echoed through the tunnel. The corridor walls were lined with rusted steel doors. None of them had handles. None had numbers. It looked less like a basement and more like an abandoned bunker. After several minutes, I noticed something strange. The floor wasn't covered in dust. Someone or something had been walking here recently. The footprints weren't clear enough to identify, but they were fresh. I followed them. They led deeper into the tunnel before suddenly disappearing, not fading away, simply ending. I stopped. There was nowhere else for whoever made them to have gone. A loud metallic clang echoed somewhere ahead. I aimed my flashlight toward the darkness. Nothing. Then another clang, closer this time. I forced myself to keep moving. The corridor eventually split into two paths. The left passage disappeared into darkness. The right passage was faintly lit by a single, flickering fluorescent light. Mounted on the wall between them was a rusted metal sign. Most of the paint had peeled away. Only one word remained readable. Archive. I frowned. An archive beneath a storage facility? It didn't make any sense. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed the sign. The passage narrowed until it ended at a heavy steel door hanging slightly open. The hinges groaned as I pushed it wider. A stale rush of air escaped from the room. Dust covered every surface. Rusted filing cabinets lined the walls. Broken chairs lay scattered across the floor. Shelves sagged beneath old cardboard boxes. It looked untouched for decades. In the center of the room stood a long wooden table. Beneath a flickering fluorescent light, something rested on it. One single photograph. Unlike everything else in the room, it wasn't buried beneath dust. It looked as though someone had placed it there recently. I walked closer. 5 men stood shoulder to shoulder in front of Blackwood Storage. Old security uniforms, old patrol flashlights. The photograph had clearly been taken decades ago. Then I noticed the man standing in the middle. His face had been scratched away. Not faded, not damaged by time. Deliberately destroyed. A shiver ran through me. I turned the photograph over. There was nothing written on the back, only a faded date. October 14th, 1981. I searched the nearby table. Most of the papers had rotted away, but one file folder remained sealed beneath a layer of dust. Across the front, in faded black letters, were 2 words, night reports. As I reached for it, the fluorescent light above me flickered once, twice, then went completely dark. The room fell silent. Only my flashlight remained, and somewhere beyond the doorway, I heard slow footsteps. Someone was walking down the corridor toward the archive. 1 step, pause, another step, closer, closer. The footsteps stopped just outside the room. I held my breath. My flashlight shook in my hand. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, very slowly, the steel door began to swing open on its own. The steel door stopped moving. It remained half open. Beyond it, only darkness. I kept the flashlight fixed on the doorway, barely breathing. "Who's there?" I called. My voice echoed down the corridor. No answer, just silence. Then, one slow footstep. It wasn't inside the room. It was somewhere in the hallway outside. Another step, closer. The sound wasn't hurried. Whoever or whatever it belonged to seemed in no rush at all. I backed away from the door until my legs hit the wooden table. The flashlight trembled in my hand. Another step, then another. The footsteps stopped just beyond the doorway. I swung the flashlight toward the corridor. Nothing. The hallway was empty. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I knew I had heard something. I slowly approached the doorway. The corridor outside was deserted, but something on the floor caught my attention. Fresh muddy footprints. Bare footprints. They hadn't been there seconds ago. They began right outside the archive door. There were 4 different sets. Each pair was a different size. 1 large, 2 medium, 1 small. As if 4 barefoot people had been standing together. Just outside the room, the prints led away into the darkness. I followed them. The corridor twisted through the underground complex before opening into a massive concrete chamber. My flashlight struggled to reveal the far walls. The room was enormous. Old machinery stood abandoned beneath thick layers of dust. Rusted pipes crossed the ceiling. Collapsed shelves lay scattered across the floor. Then my light landed on something impossible. 4 old wooden chairs, placed in a perfect circle, facing inward, as though someone had arranged them for a meeting. The muddy footprints ended at the chairs. There were no footprints leaving them. I slowly circled the room. Nothing else moved. Then my flashlight revealed another object, an old reel-to-reel tape recorder, sitting on a metal desk. A thin layer of dust covered everything, except the recorder. Someone had used it recently. A single cassette tape was already loaded inside. Beside it lay a handwritten note. It read, "Play me." Every instinct told me to leave it alone. Instead, I pressed the play button. The machine clicked. Static filled the chamber. For several seconds, nothing. Then, a man's voice, weak, terrified. "If anyone finds this, don't stay underground after midnight." The recording crackled. "My name is Daniel Harris, Night Security. October 1981. My stomach tightened. The date matched the photograph. The voice continued. "There were 5 of us, but only 1 of us came back." A long pause. Heavy breathing. We kept hearing footsteps beneath the storage units. They always sounded like 4 people walking together. But every time we followed them, we only found footprints. Another burst of static. "They aren't ghosts. They're waiting." The tape hissed loudly. We opened something that should have stayed closed. The recording suddenly distorted. Daniel's breathing became frantic. "They're here." Loud banging echoed through the speaker. Metal scraping. Someone screaming. Then, silence. The tape continued spinning. I reached forward to stop it before my hand touched the machine. A loud metallic slam echoed somewhere behind me. I spun around. The only entrance to the chamber had just closed. On its own. The flashlight beam shook violently. Then, 4 slow footsteps echoed from somewhere inside the room. Not outside. Inside. 1, 2, 3, 4. I swept the flashlight across the darkness. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard breathing. Not one person. 4 different people, breathing together, all around me. The breathing stopped. So did mine. The 4 silhouettes stood perfectly still at the edge of my flashlight's beam. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They simply watched. I couldn't make out a single face. Every time I tried to focus on one of them, my eyes seemed to drift away, as if my mind refused to see what was standing there. Then, all 4 figures took one slow step forward. My body reacted before my brain did. I turned and ran. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly. across the chamber as I sprinted toward the steel door. I grabbed the handle and pulled with everything I had. Nothing. It wouldn't move. Behind me, 4 footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. 1, 2, 3, 4. Not running, walking, slowly, deliberately. I slammed my shoulder against the door. Still nothing. My breathing became frantic. Then I remembered the emergency release wheel mounted beside the frame, hidden beneath years of rust. I spun it with both hands. At first, it refused to move. Then, with a loud metallic groan, the locking mechanism released. I pulled the heavy door open just enough to squeeze through. The moment I entered the corridor, the footsteps stopped. I looked back. The chamber was empty. The 4 figures had vanished. Only the 4 wooden chairs remained under the weak beam of my flashlight. I didn't wait. I ran. The underground corridors twisted in every direction. Left.
Right?
Another right. The passages all looked identical. I was completely lost. Then I noticed something on the wall. A faded white arrow. Exit. Relief washed over me. I followed the arrows as fast as I could, but after several turns, I froze. The arrow pointed toward a steel door. The same archive door. The one I had left several minutes earlier. Impossible. I had been running in a straight line, yet somehow, I had come back to the archive. A cold voice spoke behind me. You always come back. I spun around. Nobody. The corridor was empty. Then the voice came again, this time from somewhere ahead. You opened the door. It wasn't loud. It barely sounded human. Almost like several voices speaking at once. I backed away slowly. My flashlight flickered. When the lights steadied, someone was standing at the far end of the corridor. A man, wearing an old Blackwood Storage security uniform. His clothes were stained with dirt and age. His flashlight hung from one hand. He looked completely solid, not like the shadow figures. He slowly raised his free hand. Don't move, he whispered. I stood frozen. He looked terrified, not of me, of something behind me. Without turning around, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The old guard's eyes widened. He slowly shook his head. Whatever you do, don't look behind you. Every instinct screamed at me to turn. I clenched my jaw and stared at him instead. He took one cautious step forward. I'm Daniel, he said. The recording you heard, that was me. I felt my stomach drop. That's impossible, I whispered. You died in 1981. Daniel gave a tired smile. I wish I had. A deep metallic groan echoed through the tunnels. The lights overhead began flickering violently. Daniel's expression changed instantly. They know you're here now. The corridor grew colder. A low rumbling vibrated through the floor. Daniel stepped closer and spoke quickly. There isn't much time. The 4 you heard, they aren't the ones you should fear. I stared at him. What do you mean? He looked past my shoulder. His face drained of color. Then, in a trembling voice, he said, because something else is waking up. The corridor fell silent. Even the rumbling beneath my feet stopped. Daniel didn't. He grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. We have to move. Now, we ran. The underground halls seemed different now. Doorways I had passed before were gone. New corridors stretched into darkness. The arrows marked exit had vanished completely. It was like the tunnels were rearranging themselves around us. How is this possible? I shouted. Daniel didn't answer. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he expected something to appear at any second. Then, the lights went out. Every fluorescent tube died at once. Only our flashlights remained. For a moment, I heard nothing. Then, a low, deep sound rolled through the tunnels. Not footsteps, not machinery. It sounded like something enormous, taking a slow breath. The concrete walls vibrated. Dust rained from the ceiling. Daniel stopped walking. His face turned pale. His nose were moving. A second later, my flashlight began to flicker. The beam dimmed, brightened, dimmed again. Shadows started moving along the walls. Not because of the flashlight. They were moving on their own. Tall, unnatural shapes stretched across the concrete, crawling toward us. I swung my light around. There was nothing there, only empty corridors. But the shadows kept moving. Then I heard the 4 footsteps again. 1, 2, 3, 4. They were behind us. Daniel looked back only once. They're trying to keep it asleep, he whispered. I stared at him. The 4 figures, they're not hunting us. He shook his head. No, they're warning people away. They've been trapped here since 1981. They can't leave. Before I could ask another question, a deafening metallic scream echoed through the tunnels. Every steel door along the corridor slammed open at the same time. Hundreds of dark rooms stared back at us. Cold air rushed out of every doorway. From somewhere deep inside those rooms, voices began whispering. Dozens of them, all at once. Some cried for help. Some begged us to run. Others simply repeated my name. I covered my ears. The whispers only grew louder. Daniel grabbed my shoulder. Don't listen. We sprinted past the open rooms. As we ran, I glanced into one of them. I wish I hadn't. Inside stood another security guard. His uniform looked modern, exactly like mine. He was staring straight at me. His face was pale, terrified. Then I realized something. It was me. The room was showing me, not as I was now, but standing perfectly still, as if I'd been trapped there for years. I jerked my eyes away and kept running. The corridor finally opened into a gigantic, circular chamber. In the center stood a massive concrete shaft descending into endless darkness. Thick black chains disappeared into the pit. The air around it felt unnaturally cold. Ancient warning symbols had been carved into the concrete floor surrounding the shaft. Most had cracked with age. Several chains had already snapped. Daniel slowly lowered his flashlight. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "This is where they sealed it." A loud crack echoed through the chamber. One of the remaining chains suddenly broke. It whipped across the floor with a deafening crash. The entire underground complex shook violently. The darkness inside the shaft began to move. Not something inside it, the darkness itself. It rose slowly from the pit like living smoke, swallowing the flashlight beams without reflecting a single ray of light. The temperature dropped so fast that I could see my own breath. Daniel stepped in front of me. His hands were shaking. "If that thing reaches the surface, Blackwood Storage won't be the only place that disappears." The darkness continued climbing out of the shaft. Then, for the first time, it opened its eyes. Two enormous pale lights appeared within the black void. They weren't glowing. They were watching, and they were looking directly at me. The eyes never blinked. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It felt like every memory I'd ever had was being pulled out of my mind. Beside me, Daniel stepped forward. "This is why Blackwood Storage was built," he whispered. "It was never a storage facility. It was a prison." The ancient chains hanging around the shaft weren't there to support the structure. Every storage unit above us, every concrete wall, every corridor had been built to keep one thing buried beneath the ground. "And C-14?" I asked. Daniel never looked away from the darkness. It was the only door that led down here. When they sealed this place in 1981, they erased every official record of that unit. But every few years, it calls someone the new night guard. My blood ran cold. "May," Daniel nodded. "You were never hired by accident." The darkness rippled. A low voice echoed through the chamber, not through the air. Inside my head, "Stay." The single word felt impossibly heavy. The floor cracked beneath our feet. More chains snapped one after another. The chamber shook violently. Daniel grabbed my shoulder. "Listen carefully. Don't stop." "What about you?" "I never left this place." Before I could answer, the darkness exploded upward. Towering black tendrils shot across the chamber, smashing into the ceiling and tearing through the remaining chains. "Run." I sprinted. The tunnels collapsed around me. Concrete crashed to the floor. Pipes burst overhead. The underground maze seemed to twist one final time, trying to trap me forever. Behind me, Daniel's flashlight disappeared into the darkness. Then came one final scream. It echoed through every corridor. Silence. I didn't look back. I followed the collapsing tunnel until I saw the concrete staircase leading toward Storage Unit C-14. I climbed faster than I ever thought possible. My legs burned. My lungs felt ready to burst. Finally, I reached the steel hatch. I shoved it open. Cold night air hit my face. For the first time in what felt like hours, I saw the stars. I stumbled out into Unit C-14. The storage room looked completely normal. No hole in the floor. Only bare concrete covered in dust, as if none of it had ever existed. Police officers rushed toward me. They said they had received dozens of calls reporting explosions beneath the property. No staircase, no underground tunnels. New chamber. Blackwood Storage was demolished 3 months later. Officially, the reason was structural instability. Unofficially, I tried to move on with my life. I even convinced myself it had all been some kind of nightmare. I finally gathered the courage to watch the body camera footage from my first night. Everything looked normal. The office, the phone call, the walk to C-14. Then I reached the moment I entered the underground tunnels. The camera suddenly glitched. Static filled the screen for several seconds. When the picture returned, I froze. I wasn't alone. Someone had been walking behind me the entire time. Not Daniel. Not the four silent figures. Its body was made of moving darkness. Its pale eyes never left me. Frame after frame. It followed only a few steps behind. Even when I turned around, the hallway appeared empty. But the camera still saw it. The recording ended as I climbed out of Unit C-14. Just before the screen cut to black, the figure slowly leaned toward the camera and whispered one sentence. "You laughed, but I didn't." I deleted the footage. It reappeared the next morning, sometimes late at night. My phone vibrates with a notification that has no sender. When I open it, there's only one live video feed. Camera ER. The corridor outside, Unit C-14. The storage facility was demolished months ago, but the camera is still recording. And every night, at exactly 上午12:17, someone opens the door.